What's the scariest thing you've ever experienced in your life? Story 1. Standing on the front stoop of my apartment at 2 a.m. smoking a cigarette, everything was completely silent the entire time I was standing there. All at once a train horn blew. The little 5-year-old girl next door screamed, and a sudden gust of wind came out of nowhere and slammed the open door against my shoulder. For exactly 1 second, I genuinely thought something unseen was attacking me, and my heart was pounding so hard I almost felt like I might cry. It honestly felt like it took a couple of years off my life. For the record, the little girl probably screamed because she and her mom usually stayed up late and were likely playing. Story 2. This happened a long time ago, about 25 years ago, when I had tree trimmers working at my house for 2 days and I was living alone at the time. I even set out some men's shoes on the porch, but after being around for 2 full days, it was probably obvious to anyone paying attention that I was a single woman. The night the crew finished, I was upstairs in bed late, around 1 a.m., with my car in the driveway and my bedroom light on, so it was clear someone was home. I was reading when I heard a noise downstairs, something familiar that I couldn't place at first, and then I heard it again, followed by things falling to the floor. I suddenly realized it was the sound of one of my window screens being pushed open and the books I had lined up on the sill falling. I froze in fear for a full minute, listening with all my senses on high alert, and then I heard another thump that I assumed was someone's feet landing on the wooden floor. There was someone inside my house. I grabbed the bat beside my bed and went to grab the phone, but this was before cell phones and I had left the cordless downstairs. I locked my bedroom door and started shouting that I knew someone was there, that I had a weapon, and that I was already on the phone with the police. I pretended to talk to 911 as I opened my bedroom window and removed the screen in case I needed to jump. Something, maybe my yelling or the noise I made, set off my neighbor's dogs and their movement triggered the motion lights in their backyard. I stood at my door with my ear pressed to it, listening while pretending to continue the 911 call, ready to hear the old wooden stairs creak if anyone came up. But everything went silent. Then I heard a scuff, the window downstairs rattling again, and the sound of someone running beneath my window as they jumped back out the same way they came in. I looked out but couldn't see anything, and I never found out whether it was my shouting, the mention of the police, or the dogs that scared him away. I had to go downstairs to get the cordless phone and call the police, and I stood listening for a long time, terrified and shaking with so much adrenaline, I thought my heart might give out. When I finally unlocked my door, bat in hand, I crept downstairs, grabbed the phone, ran back up, locked the door, and called 911 until officers arrived. When they searched the house, the study window was standing open with the screen removed. My books were scattered, and bits of dirt and leaves from someone's shoes were on the floor, with a step stool from my garage outside the window. Seeing that dirt on my floor was the moment I knew someone had truly been inside. He had entered knowing I was home. The police immediately asked whether I had any recent work done, and of course I had. The tree trimmers, who had spent 2 full days around the house and likely realized I was alone. After that night, I was terrified to stay there, feeling lucky he got scared off, but violated and worried he might return. So I spent months staying with my mom or having someone stay at my place. The window lock had been broken, which was the only reason it was left unsecured, and I had it fixed and added nails for extra security since I couldn't afford a full system. The company was contacted, but with no proof there was nothing more to do than inform the owner. It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, knowing someone climbed into my home late at night while I was there. And I am genuinely grateful things did not end differently because he was not there to steal. He knew I was home and still came in. Story 3. Home invasions are no joke. About 3 years ago, I was home at night, cooking at around 3:30 in the morning because I do catering and had an event coming up, and I heard noises outside my ground floor basement apartment window that I had left slightly open for air circulation. I assumed it was just raccoons or something similar, but I was very wrong. When I looked over, I saw 2 hands gripping the edge of the window beneath the blinds, and when I yelled asking what was going on, the entire window was ripped off the hinges, a foot came through the screen, and suddenly an intoxicated and disheveled man around 6 feet 2 inches and about 250 pounds stepped into my kitchen, while I, a much smaller woman, stood frozen in fear. He lunged toward me, grabbed my arm, and left a bit of blood on me. And at that point, my brain finally reacted, and I ran for the door, which thankfully was a straight shot from the kitchen. As I ran up the stairs toward the first floor of the building, he chased me, grabbed my legs, and tried to pull me back down. But I kept managing to break free while screaming for help. When I reached the first floor, the man who lived above me, who was in his mid-50s, opened his door and told me to come inside. And when I did, the intruder tried to force his way in, and even fought the neighbor who had let me inside until the man finally managed to shut the door. The intruder then wandered to the parking lot of the mortuary next door and fell asleep in the bushes. The police arrived within about 10 minutes, and their dogs found him quickly, still asleep. I was brought out to identify him, and after confirming it was him, he was taken into custody. Later, the officers told me two things that stuck with me. First, judging by the scene, he had likely been watching me through the window for quite a while. And second, when arrested, he immediately explained unprompted that he could not have harmed that girl because he believed his medication prevented it. He ended up getting about 1 year in prison. I had re-signed the lease for another year just 1 week earlier, which made the following year extremely difficult, especially because my ex-husband thought it was funny to pretend someone was breaking in late at night and would laugh or get upset when I had panic reactions. It was a very rough year, but I eventually left both the apartment and that relationship, and life has been much better since. Story 4. All right, I do not usually reply to things like this, but I have one. I was about 16 at the time, relaxing at home alone, watching television in the dark with my bulldog named Harley. We were lying together on the couch, sharing snacks, when suddenly Harley stood up and slowly walked toward the hallway by the television, hunched over in full alert mode. I saw the hair on his back stand up, and at the same moment I felt chills run across my whole body as fear washed over me. I slowly stood up too, and we both stared into the hallway, which looked darker than the rest of the house and felt as if something unseen was standing there looking back at us. After a moment, the feeling passed. Harley relaxed, and I ran to turn every light in the house on. I still get chills thinking about it to this day. I used to pet Harley and wonder if he remembered that night the way I did. But he was such a cheerful, carefree dog that it probably never bothered him at all. He passed away in 2010 at the age of 12. Story 5. When I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, I spent the night at my grandparents' house and was lying on the couch trying to fall asleep when I heard whispering. There was a painting of my aunt on the living room wall, and it sounded like it was talking to me in her voice, asking if I was behaving and talking the way she normally would. She told me to wake up my grandfather because she needed to talk to him, and when I did, he realized she was not there and started scolding me. In the middle of that, he noticed someone moving outside the window, grabbed his pistol, and told me to stay with my grandmother. A minute or two later, we heard a gunshot. There was a correctional facility for young adults about 20 miles away, and 3 individuals had escaped after harming a guard. They were sizing up the house to steal the truck and anything else they could, but my grandfather saw them first and ended up injuring one in the shoulder. I still have no idea why the painting sounded like it was talking to me, and my grandparents never experienced anything paranormal before or after that night. Story 6. My childhood home was genuinely unsettling. My sister often complained about seeing faces in the lights, and my brother, who was around 5 at the time, once ran into the house crying because he said a man hanging in the garage scared him even though nobody was there. I woke up once to a dark figure standing by my bed and slept on my parents' bedroom floor for days afterward. In the basement, there was an actual cave with dirt walls that went back maybe 15 feet, and since I never went inside, I have no idea what was in it. Electronic devices would turn on by themselves, and our dog would stare at one corner of a room and growl. Eventually, we bought the house across the street. After the neighbors moved out, but before we moved in, we were still sleeping in the old house when, in the middle of the night, all the fire alarms suddenly went off. My dad checked everything, and it was fine, so he removed the batteries and we went back to bed. An hour later, more alarms went off, including the carbon monoxide detectors and the fire alarms without batteries. My dad turned them off, we grabbed blankets and sleeping bags, and we all left to sleep in the living room of the new house across the street. The next day, someone checked for carbon monoxide, and reported everything was normal. We moved in immediately and never slept in that old house again, and I have never experienced anything paranormal since. Story 7. I was 7 years old and my two sisters and I were home alone in our new house that was still unfinished, with no phone or anything installed yet, and our mom was in the city a few hours away and would not be home until late. The house was deep in the countryside with a quarter-mile gravel driveway and the closest neighbors nearly 2 miles away. We were playing cards when our dog suddenly started barking like crazy, and my sister, who was around 11 or 12, went outside and saw an old pale green van driving slowly down our driveway before stopping halfway, and a person got out and approached our dog. She was a friendly dog and not aggressive at all, so she went right up to him and he coaxed her into the van before they continued driving toward the house, which made my sister run inside, lock all the doors, and start panicking. After about 5 minutes of hearing our dog's muffled barks, there was loud banging on the doors as if people were trying to get in. So we went downstairs where they could see someone was home, and we saw 3 men dressed in all black with ski masks, one of whom was a little person, standing outside waving at us before trying even harder to force their way in and break the windows. Our windows were thick, double-pane semi-plexiglass that were apparently impossible to break. So we ran upstairs, hid in the attic armed with a hammer and screwdrivers, and listened for almost an hour as they banged on everything and yelled that they were going to get in and that we should let them so no one would get hurt. Eventually we heard them drive away, and after waiting about 20 minutes, my sister went to bring our dog into the attic. Around 2 hours later, someone came back and rang the doorbell and knocked nonstop for about 15 minutes, and although we never checked, we assumed it was the same people. I still get nightmares about it, even though it was about 20 years ago. Story 8. When I was 16, I was on a summer work exchange in Quebec, Canada, and one night I invited a friend from the program to stay over at my billet family's home. We slept downstairs in the basement, where they had a couch and a spare mattress. And although the event is fuzzy, I remember waking up sensing that something was wrong and seeing a shadowy figure standing above me before that figure reached down and touched my chest. I was in a fog and froze completely, and it seemed like the figure then went back upstairs and out the front door. I lay there in the dark and noticed that the stuffed animal I slept with, a gift from my boyfriend at the time, was now several feet away from the mattress. When I became more coherent, I started shaking because I knew something disturbing had happened. So I went upstairs and saw that the front door was wide open with the sunrise starting. I hurried up to the parents' bedroom and switched on the light, trying to explain that someone had been inside and touched me, but I was a panicked 16-year-old who did not have the French vocabulary for what had just happened. The billet mother seemed annoyed that I woke them, and it took a mix of broken French and hand gestures for her to understand, after which they called the local police, and an officer who spoke English came. Nothing ever came of it, and my friend who slept over somehow slept through the entire thing. Almost 15 years later, it still stays with me. Story 9, I got into an argument with my boyfriend over the phone, and because I was a reckless teenager, I decided to walk to his house in the middle of the night, even though that meant passing through a dim and questionable part of town. My 18-year-old self did not care, even though I was crying and stressed enough to get a nosebleed, so blood streaked my sweater as I kept going. I came across a group of 4 or 5 men who had a ladder propped against a wall leading into a wealthy subdivision home, and I froze the moment I saw one already climbing. They had not noticed me until one turned his head and looked directly at me, and my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. He let out a startled yell, which drew the attention of the others, and they reacted with panic. Seeing a crying girl with blood on her face and wearing pajamas apparently frightened them more than anything else, and combined with my long bangs and features, I probably looked like something out of a horror movie to them. The man on the ladder fell and the entire group ran to their car and drove off. For once in my life, I was grateful for my spontaneous nosebleeds. Story 10. As a young child, I had an imaginary friend who would step through the window beside me and sit to watch movies with me on an old television and VCR. And I remember clearly that I called him Sonny and that he was extremely tall enough that he had to bend down as he stepped into my playroom. The next part comes mostly from my mother's memory, because mine is fragmented, and I am not sure which parts are real recollection. She told me that while she was going through a box of my father's belongings, she found a stack of pictures of his family and set them out for him to look at when he got home from work. I spent time with her while she sorted through them and stayed mostly quiet until we reached a picture of my grandfather on my father's side, who had passed away many years earlier in a tragic car accident involving a drunk driver. And I pointed to the picture and said that this was Sonny, the person who came through the window to watch movies with me. My mother explained that this was my grandfather and that his name was written clearly on the back, nothing like the name Sonny. Later, when my father came home and looked through the pictures, my mother told him what I had said, and he was shocked because, although his father's given name was not Sonny, it was a nickname his coworkers had called him, one that I had no way of knowing. Combined with the tall, slender appearance and my recognizing the picture, my parents became convinced that my grandfather had been visiting me in spirit. The memories I do have are limited to his presence in that playroom, the name Sonny, and the image of a tall man climbing through the window. But I have little sense of when it began or ended, while my mother remembers clearly because it frightened her deeply. Story 11. It happened at my dad's house in Mexico, and at the time it was only me and my older brother at home because my dad was working and it was already nighttime. But we were used to that since we grew up hearing my dad's friends tell stories about a little girl who would supposedly stand in front of the restroom and not let them use it whenever they came over to have drinks, though we always thought it was just a joke adults told to scare each other. That night I was lying on my back in my dad's room with the television on in the right corner and the bed pushed against the right wall, while the door was in the left corner facing me. And outside that door, there were about 5 feet leading to another small room with a doorway in the middle that opened into the rest of the house, which was not big at all. If you stepped into that little hallway and turned right, the restroom was immediately there. And from where I lay, I could clearly see the sink. And my brother, who was in the living room, could also see that same sink, even though we could not see each other at all. Every light in the house was off, with the only light coming from the television in my room and the one in the living room. As I was watching television, something white appeared in the corner of my left eye, and instinctively I turned my head. And that was when I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing directly in front of the sink, wearing what looked like a dress and appearing just a bit taller than the average sink she was standing by. As I looked at this figure, I was fully aware of what I was seeing, and after about 4 seconds I blinked and she vanished instantly. So I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, like most of us do when something strange happens. A few minutes later, my brother came into the room and said, "Did you see that?" And I replied, "Did I see what?" Because I was not sure what he meant, and although part of me wondered if he meant the little girl, it seemed too unbelievable to consider, so I dismissed the thought. He asked again, "You didn't see that?" And I repeated, "Did I see what?" And finally he said, "Did you see the little girl?" That was the moment we realized we had both seen the exact same childlike figure at the same time from 2 different parts of the house. Story 12. When I was 10 years old, I was home alone one night because my mom, who was divorced at the time, worked night shifts. And since this was in the late 1990s in a quiet town in Sweden, we did not really have the habit of locking the front door. I was lying in bed and had not fallen asleep yet when suddenly the front door opened and someone walked into the apartment. And it was far too early for my mom to be home, so I sat up quickly and could make out the shape of a very tall man standing in the kitchen just outside my room. He stopped in his tracks and casually said hello, and when I switched on my nightlight, he immediately began making small talk in an attempt not to scare me, mentioning my mom by name and referencing things only someone who knew her would know, which reassured me a little but still felt wrong in some way. He started talking about my mom's antique flintlock ornaments, saying she had promised to sell them to him, and he kept looking around my room until he noticed my Nintendo 64 and asked if I was planning on selling it, which I wasn't. He said he had only come by because his mother had a stomach problem and needed to use our bathroom, and I just nodded and said okay, because I did not know what else to do. He walked out of my room and opened the front door again, and I heard someone else enter, speaking in a low voice that sounded like an older woman, and then he popped his head back into my room and told me I could go back to sleep and that they would be out shortly. I was still nervous, But I did what he said and turned off my light and lay back down, listening for almost half an hour as he moved through the apartment. Eventually, I heard the toilet flush, followed by the front door closing, and after waiting a moment, I got up, checked the apartment to make sure no one was still inside, locked the front door, and went back to bed. The next morning, my mom was confused about some missing items, and it turned out the man had taken our VCR, a couple of gold rings, and my mom's silk pajamas. Story 13. Back in the 1980s, when I was growing up in suburban Chicago, my brother, some of our friends, and I got really into using a homemade Ouija board, even though our mom made it very clear she disapproved. But of course, that did not stop us at all. One afternoon, we were in my bedroom on the second floor, with the lights turned low, all of us getting ourselves worked up as we focused on the board and imagined the spirit world responding, when suddenly there was loud slamming on the bedroom window. Since we were on the second floor, it was not possible that some random person could have just walked up to the window, so we all turned at the same time and saw a frightening face pressed against the glass, staring straight at us. Within about 1 second, we all screamed and bolted downstairs in pure panic, and as we reached the bottom floor, the front door swung open and the same figure stepped into the house. A moment later, the person pulled a stocking off their head, and we realized it was our mom, who had figured out what we were doing, gone out to the garage to grab a ladder, put a stocking over her head, climbed up to the second floor window, banged on it, and scared us so badly we probably lost 10 years of our lives. She stood there laughing hysterically while we tried to recover from the shock. Story 14. This is the story of how a deeply unsettling encounter with a frightening man at a harbor cafe ended up saving me from something far more terrifying, and it happened in the autumn of 1994 when I was 19 years old. At the time, my dad had been working abroad for almost 6 months, and I was excitedly planning a surprise visit because he and I had always been incredibly close, especially since I was an only child and had lost my mother to cancer when I was still a baby. So our tiny family consisted only of the two of us, and he made up for everything by being the most wonderful parent imaginable. Now that I was older, I appreciated him even more and had already booked my ticket, ready to go and surprise him. I needed to take the ferry, though, and even though I had just gotten my driver's license, I felt extremely uneasy about driving my little car on board. So I decided not to bring a car at all and planned to rent one once I arrived. I was early and they had not started letting people board, so I decided to spend some time at a nearby cafe. Inside were many truck drivers, and I quickly realized I was the only woman there, and one man around 40 years old with pale blue eyes and tattoos all over kept staring at me openly. Feeling suddenly uncomfortable, I got up to leave, only for him to follow me out the door. And since this was before everyone had cell phones, I felt a rising fear as I tried to figure out what to do. I took out my ticket and pretended to study it to look busy, and he suddenly snatched it from my hand saying, "I'm on the same boat. I'll have hours of your company then. How lovely," in a tone that mixed forced friendliness with something darker beneath it. A heavy certainty hit me that if I boarded that ferry with this man, who now knew my booking details, I would be in real danger, though I could not explain why the feeling was so overwhelming. I made the decision on the spot not to get on the boat, and since the ticket was inexpensive, I planned to simply board the next ferry instead. I hid in the ladies' room until I knew the ferry had departed and then went to rebook. The story could have ended as nothing more than a disturbing encounter with a threatening stranger, but it didn't. My instinct had been completely right. That ferry was the MS Estonia, and the date was September 28, 1994, the night she tragically sank in the Baltic Sea, taking 852 lives and becoming the worst ferry catastrophe in Swedish history. I still recall that day with horror and cannot help wondering what would have happened if that man had not frightened me away, if I had ignored my instinct and boarded the ship instead of waiting for the next one. Would I have been among the survivors, or would my dad have seen my name on the list of lives lost in the Baltic Sea? Story 15. Now, I have always been the skeptic type who does not believe in ghosts, UFOs, or legendary creatures, and I prefer hard evidence and the scientific method over anything supernatural. But one night made me genuinely wonder. This was a few years before I left for college during one of those perfect summers when a group of my friends and I were extremely bored, so one of them suggested going ghost hunting. The place we chose was a hill called Bale Hill because everyone loves a good ghost story. 5 of us piled into my old Chevy Cavalier and drove into the Pennsylvania countryside, joking and listening to music until we reached the hill, where darkness surrounded everything except a few distant farmhouses. We drove up the hill, made a quick turn at the top, and slowly went down a dirt road. About halfway down, I stopped the car because I noticed a strange old fence made of rotting wood that looked like something straight out of a horror film, and I was transfixed by it and by the suffocating darkness around us. As I stared, I heard a startled noise from the back seat, and suddenly my friends in the back began screaming at the top of their lungs, yelling to drive immediately. Without looking, I floored the car and sped away, assuming at first that they were playing a prank on me. But when I looked back, one of the girls was crying uncontrollably and insisted it was not a joke. Confused, I asked what they had seen. One said she first saw a light moving on the hilltop, another said it moved toward the car, and then the crying girl screamed that something white had crawled out from under the car. Another friend added that whatever it was moved extremely fast, almost like a spider, and the crying girl insisted it was wearing a dress. I drove as fast as I could out of the area, and even afterward they all swore they saw something skittering after us. Time passed, I left for school, and one weekend while visiting home, I told an old friend who loved local history about the experience. He immediately said, "Oh, Spook Hill! Your friend saw her." When I asked who, he told me that in the 1800s a woman had been killed in a carriage accident right by that fenced area, and though the passengers survived, the wagon wheels had taken her life. Legend said she still searched the hill with a lantern trying to find her way home, and with a grin he said, "You're lucky she didn't follow you home, young man." Even though I live 500 miles away now and remain a skeptic, that night on Beale Hill, with the lady in the lantern, still scares me every time I think about it. Story 16. When I used to work moving furniture, I went to a 2-story house that had been damaged in a fire, and although the fire had not destroyed the place, the elderly owner no longer stayed there. He must have owned a lot of pets, because there were leashes and the little bells used on cat collars scattered everywhere throughout the house. During breaks, my coworker, who we will call Bob, and I would joke around since no one else was there. In the middle of the living room, there was an old piano we would play with, but every time we touched it, the piano would play the exact same 2 notes repeatedly, and at first I assumed it was rodents, since there were droppings everywhere. But it was always the same 2 notes and always in response to us. Then more strange things started happening, like loud noises in empty rooms, even though only Bob and I were inside. Doors would slam shut directly in front of me when there was no wind and no open windows anywhere. Bells from the scattered collars would roll or be tossed across the room when I was alone. In the garage, a wooden board that was propping up the motor for the garage door suddenly snapped in the opposite direction and nearly hit Bob while we were moving boxes. More things happened that I cannot fully explain, but that is the general idea. I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural because I always considered myself a person who needed scientific explanations. But after experiencing things like that, things I cannot logically account for, I admit that it changed my mind in ways I never expected. Story 17. 2 weeks ago, my mom and stepdad went away for a weekend trip, so I had the house entirely to myself with only my dog for company. It was a Saturday night and I got home from work at around 1 a.m., and since my dog needed to go outside, I grabbed a cigarette and stepped out into the backyard. I live out in the countryside, completely surrounded by woods, and even with the porch lights on it is pitch black because the trees swallow the light, making it impossible to see anything past a few feet. I had barely opened the back door when I heard the trees shifting, and at first I thought maybe the sprinklers were turning on. But after listening another few seconds, I realized the sound was coming from multiple spots, as if something very large was slowly moving through the brush. It sounded massive, easily the size of a bear, trudging heavily through the woods about 10 yards away from me. I live in a bayou-type area, about 20 minutes from Galveston, Texas, and I could not imagine any local animal that would sound like a giant creature pushing its way through the trees. Hoping it might just be a neighbor, I called out a nervous, "Who's there?" but received no answer. just the sound of branches snapping. Frozen in fear, I stood halfway out the door while my dog stared at me, and then toward the source of the noise, with equal confusion and worry. I called him back inside and ran upstairs to another door that also opens toward the backyard, hoping for a better vantage point and desperately searching for the source. Whether a mountain lion, a coyote, an alligator, anything. But I still saw nothing at all. I listened to this unseen creature circle toward the side of the house until I slammed the door shut and locked every door in the house. If anyone familiar with the Bay Area of Texas has any idea what kind of animal or phenomenon I heard, I would genuinely love to know, because that night left me shaken in a way I cannot forget. Story 18. This experience was not exactly paranormal, but it was frightening in a very real way. My friends and I were having a small farewell party for our German friend who was heading home, and around midnight my friend John suggested that we all take a late-night walk to a nearby bridge about 2 or 3 miles away. The only people who agreed were me, Mac, and Drew, and all three of them were athletic soccer players in great shape, which becomes important later. We had walked about a mile when a car approached, so we stepped off to the side of the road, but instead of passing, the driver slowed down and stopped a few hundred feet away with the engine still running. He got out and yelled accusingly, asking why we had made an obscene gesture at him, even though we hadn't, and he began walking toward us in a way that felt threatening. John suddenly yelled, "Run!" And he, Mac, and Drew bolted at full speed down the road, leaving me to keep up for only a few seconds before I slowed to a jog. I hoped it was some kind of prank, but the terrifying part was that the man did not get back in his car for a long moment. I couldn't see him clearly in the darkness, but I could see the unmoving taillights, and once the car finally drove off, I started walking again. My friends were far ahead by then, and every time a car passed, I dove into the bushes just in case. Eventually, I heard John calling my name, and his sister drove up to pick us all up after he called her and explained the situation. The only bright side was that my slow-running pace accidentally made me look brave, since my friends thought I had not been scared at all. Story 19. I think the scariest moment for me was when I must have somehow angered something in our house without realizing it. It was early in the morning, and I was rushing around like usual because I am notoriously late for everything, including high school. I was going up and down the stairs repeatedly in a frantic, disorganized way when suddenly the hallway felt wrong. It seemed darker than normal, and the air around me felt filled with a kind of hostility, like the sensation you get when someone intimidating stands over you with malicious intent. Except this feeling came from the far end of the hallway opposite the stairs, even though no one was there. Feeling nervous, I turned toward the stairs, and that was when I could physically feel something terrifying rushing toward me. It was as if a long, twisted, clawed hand of pure darkness reached out and nearly grabbed me. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, convinced that if whatever was behind me caught me, I would be harmed. I had never felt fear or vulnerability like that in my entire life. But the moment I reached the kitchen at the bottom of the stairs, the presence vanished instantly. It had chased me down the hallway and to the first floor before disappearing, either retreating or exhausting whatever energy it had. All I knew was that it felt deeply sinister. Since that day, I have been unusually mindful every time I use the stairs, just in case I might be crossing paths with something that does not want me there. Story 20. This happened in Memphis about 14 years ago, since I am 28 now, and it has been so long that I cannot fully remember the exact year anymore. I was in my room when I heard someone talking very loudly outside, so I peeked through my window and saw a man who I knew lived a few houses up the street parked in front of our home, pointing toward our yard and yelling. All of a sudden, he pulled out a firearm and began shooting at our house. I was terrified, but somehow unable to pull myself away from the window, and I heard my uncle shout for me to get on the floor, yet I remained frozen. Later, my dad told me that he heard the gunshots and that the moment he dropped to the ground, a bullet passed straight through the wall exactly where he had been standing. When the police arrived, they asked him to show them where the shots had entered, and our house had a small area off to the side that was very dark at night and covered in thick bushes. When my dad walked over to that spot, he suddenly yelled out and backed away because there was a boy around 16 or 17 lying still in the bushes, with a wound to the head and a firearm in his hand. My dad told the officers that I had witnessed everything, so I went with them to the station and identified the man who had been shooting. When they arrested him, he had tried to hide the shell casings by throwing them into his outside garbage bin. He told the police that the boy had been trying to steal substances from him, but whatever happened, it was something I have never forgotten. Story 21. I encountered a ghost for the first time when I was 12 years old while touring a house with my sister, my father, and a realtor because my dad was considering buying it as our next home. The house had been built in the 1800s, though that did not matter much since life and loss can happen in any home, old or new. The four of us were exploring the first floor, looking into closets and discussing the pros and cons of each room. My sister was wearing her favorite black ankle boots with buttons up the sides, chosen because they matched her old-world Victorian style, and I heard those boots clip-clopping up the stairs in an excited rhythm. Being the younger sibling who followed her everywhere, I immediately raced after her. I entered the bedroom at the top of the stairs but did not see her, so I rushed into the bedroom to the left, and she was not there either. I crossed back into the first bedroom and opened the long cupboard built beneath a slanted salt box roof, but she was not inside. I called out her name in a half-complaining tone, assuming she had already found an excellent hiding place, but then I heard her answer from the dining room downstairs. A cold rush of fear hit me because she said she had been downstairs the entire time and had not gone back up the stairs since our first walkthrough. I do not remember running down the stairs, only the dizziness and buzzing in my head as we left the house and returned to the car, while my father and sister calmly discussed the home as if nothing unusual had happened. To this day, I can still picture the pale green interior of that empty cupboard, still hear the hard-soled boots running up the stairs, the pitch rising as they reached the landing, and I still remember the moment I realized that from then on, I would never again be completely certain that I was truly alone inside my home. Story 22. When I was in college, I received a research grant to study the connection between tourism and ancient religious sites, focusing specifically on locations considered portals to the underworld in Greece and Belize. During my time in Belize, I befriended a bartender whose sister handled bookkeeping for a travel company, and she arranged an incredible opportunity for me to visit a newly opened cave that until then had only been accessible to researchers. I went with two men who were in training to become guides for the cave, as well as the main guide, who brought his wife and child. Before entering, I witnessed a Miyam purification ceremony, and inside the cave I saw ancient pots still dusted with remnants of chocolate, volcanic bloodletting knives, collection bowls, and even handled a stalagmite that had been used as a sacrificial club. Deeper into the cave, we came across a carved stalagmite, and our guide explained how the Maya priests would place a torch at its base, and the shadow cast on the wall would form the image of a jaguar. He had us sit in front of it, turned off our headlamps, and lit a small red lighter at the base. Even though it was such a tiny flame, in the extreme darkness of the cave, it projected a huge shadow that looked exactly like the head of a jaguar. As we watched in amazed silence, the shadow on the wall seemed to open and close its mouth and slowly turn toward us, and all four of us reacted the same way. We immediately switched our headlamps back on and hurried right out of that chamber without saying a word. Story 23. This happened over a decade ago when I was probably 16 or 17, and my mom's house was on the very last street of a large neighborhood, meaning there was no reason for anyone to drive past it unless they lived in one of the 20 or so houses at that end. The houses were close to the street, and both mine and my sister's bedroom windows faced the front yard and the road. I was lying on my bed, which was up against the window, watching television and talking to my boyfriend at the time on the phone when I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. This was before smartphones, so I ignored it and finished my call. When I hung up, there were multiple messages waiting, starting off casually by asking how I was and what I was doing, but quickly shifting into comments like, "Who are you talking to that's so important you can't answer me? That was a long phone call. Your show is ending. What's next?" Even referencing the exact show I had on, though I don't remember which one it was. Then the messages turned into descriptions of what I was wearing at that very moment. I kept calling and texting my boyfriend about it, and he insisted it was someone he had upset trying to scare me, which made no sense. but he was older and I thought he was cool. As the texts became more taunting and threatening, I woke my parents up and they called the police. The number traced back to a disposable phone, but the officers searched the neighborhood and found several spots in our neighbor's yard where someone had been sitting out of sight while watching my window. It also looked like they had walked through our backyard, peered into the downstairs windows, and even stood on our front porch. Nothing ever came of it, and I broke up with that boyfriend for unrelated reasons shortly after, and nothing like that ever happened again, though I keep my blinds closed much more now. Part of me still wonders if that boyfriend staged the whole thing so he could play the hero, because he kept insisting I shouldn't call the police and should let him handle it, right before I woke my parents. Story 24. This is the only strange experience I have ever had, and I never figured out what it was. My girlfriend at the time and I decided on a whim to drive to Half Moon Bay Beach one night after getting food, and since we were unprepared and did not bring a flashlight, we had to cross a large open field in the dark with only the moonlight to guide us. We walked maybe 50 yards when we noticed a black shape hovering just above the grass on the side of the path. We ignored it at first while keeping an eye on it, but then it started to move, and not knowing if it was an animal or maybe a bag blowing in the wind, we panicked and slowly walked back toward the car. Once we passed the shrubs and reached the cul-de-sac where a streetlight illuminated the road, we turned around and, unbelievably, the dark shape had followed us. It was a black cloud-like form, about 2 feet tall, with no face or features, just an ink-like shadow sliding across the ground. It made no sound while crossing the grass and never changed shape. We sprinted to the car and left without looking back. If only I had seen it, I would have chalked it up to my eyes playing tricks on me. But my girlfriend saw it too. I asked my grandmother later, and she told me that in her folklore, such shapes were water spirits of people who had drowned returning to land. I don't know what it was, and I'm not superstitious or religious, but I have always wondered. If I saw it again now, I think I would be less afraid and more curious about what exactly it could have been. Story 25. As a teenager, I worked as a janitor at one of the oldest theaters on the East Coast, a building with 4 floors connected by strange hallways and staircases, and a dark basement full of tunnels leading to nearby buildings. There were 4 pianos in the theater, one in the unused attic, one in the ballroom on the 4th floor, a large grand piano locked in a storage case on stage, and another directly beneath the stage. I often worked alone around midnight or 1 a.m. after shows ended, and without fail I would hear what sounded like footsteps climbing one of the staircases, even though no one else was in the building. The pianos sometimes played notes on their own, even though they were not player pianos, and on a few occasions I heard distinct flute practice echoing through empty halls. On the 2nd floor there were portraits that already looked eerie because the eyes seemed to follow you. And one night at around 1:30 a.m., while I was vacuuming the audience seating area, I noticed movement near the ghost light. Standing beside it was a woman dressed in clothing that looked like it was from the late 1800s. I turned off the vacuum and asked if she needed help, but she only smiled and shook her head. I thought maybe she was part of the show running that week, so I continued vacuuming. But after a moment I looked up again, and she was at the edge of the stage spinning, her dress fanning out as she danced. I asked again if she needed anyone, and again she shook her head and smiled. I went back to vacuuming and then heard a soft voice say, "Thank you, it looks so nice." But when I looked up, she was gone. She had vanished in the seconds I looked away. The next evening, I heard a loud thump from the 2nd floor and found that a large frame photograph had fallen. The nail had come out of the plaster. It was an old family portrait of the man who built the theater and his wife, and I recognized her instantly as the woman I had seen dancing on stage the night before. I later learned that the production running at the time did not include any period costumes. I told my manager, and she said I had met the wife of the man who built the theater. I do not claim to believe in ghosts, but I truly cannot explain what happened. Other times when I went to the basement for supplies, I heard people running through those pitch-black tunnels, even though there were no lights and I never saw any flashlights. That place left a deep mark on me during high school, and I have never experienced anything like it since. Story 26. This happened about 3 years ago when my husband and I went out on a double date with my sister and the boyfriend she had been with for several months. She lives in Los Angeles, and when they flew up to visit, we took them into Seattle for the day. We had been out for hours and were walking back toward the ferry because it was getting really late. While we were walking, two men suddenly jumped in front of us with knives in their hands, and one of them said they needed our phones and money. I froze completely, and so did my sister, while her boyfriend immediately jumped behind her. But my husband grabbed my arm, pulled me behind him, and told the man to get away as he pulled out his gun. The two men jumped back, and one ran immediately, but the other said something like, "We will be back," before taking off as well. That made everything so much worse because my husband told us we needed to move fast before they came back with friends. My sister and I took off our heels and ran barefoot in our dresses, while my husband stayed beside us and her boyfriend followed behind. It was around 20 blocks to the ferry, and the entire time I kept thinking those men were chasing us. Maybe they weren't, but I was terrified because my husband still had his gun in his hand, and I was convinced something terrible was about to happen. When we reached the terminal, he put the gun away, we bought our tickets, and we waited inside, where he kept pacing and watching the doors while my sister and I clung to each other. After a couple of minutes, those same two men showed up outside, but they did not buy tickets, so they couldn't come in, and it turned into a silent stare down between them and my husband until they finally left. Eventually, we boarded the ferry, found a booth away from everyone else, and I held on to my husband as if I were hanging off a cliff. I cried most of the ride because I was exhausted, relieved, and shaken, and later he told me my sister had been clinging to his other arm while her boyfriend sat across from us. When we got home safely, everything hit me all at once, and I clung to my husband even more. The next morning, my sister told me she had broken up with her boyfriend that night and that he booked an early flight home. I know I had never been so scared in my life, but I still look back at the moment my husband pulled me behind him with more love and respect than I can describe. Story 27. One of the creepiest things that ever happened to me was back in middle school, when my friend and I were hanging out at her house and went into the basement to grab a pizza and pick out a board game from the shelf. I remember turning away from the shelf to answer something she said when suddenly my mind felt foggy, and I instinctively raised my hands above my head because it felt exactly like cobwebs were wrapped around every one of my fingers, and I was trying to shake them off. At the same moment, I was seeing my friend doing the exact same thing, but it felt like I was seeing her partly with my mind rather than only with my eyes. Then everything stopped as suddenly as it had started. I lowered my hands and she lowered hers, and we just stared at each other in total confusion. It was a long time ago, so I honestly do not remember what we did afterward or if we even talked about it. To this day, I have no idea what happened. It could have been something supernatural or something happening in my mind, but it was the middle of the day in 6th or 7th grade, and I was a normal kid who did not drink or take anything and had never experienced anything like that before or after. Story 28. When I was in my early teens, my dad had a house in the Santa Cruz Mountains of California, and the summer after 8th grade, when I was around 13 or 14, we spent months building a fort together in the woods behind the house. It was incredibly solid, partly dug into the ground about 3 feet deep with a roof rising about 3 feet above the surface, supported by 4 heavy logs and covered with 2x4s, tarps, and layers of branches and brush as camouflage. Nobody except my dad and I knew where it was, and it was about a 20-minute hike into extremely dense forest. After working on it all summer, I asked if I could spend the night out there alone, and he agreed. That night I brought my sleeping bag, snacks, water, a pocket knife, and a walking stick that doubled as a spear. I called him at about 9 p.m. to say I was settled. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing footsteps outside, heavier than even my dad's, and he was easily over 250 pounds. The footsteps circled the fort, accompanied by a deep exhaling sound. After about 30 minutes of this, whatever it was started throwing rocks that bounced off the slanted roof. At first they were small like pebbles, but they gradually became larger until they were the size of fists by around 3 in the morning. I sat behind the door gripping my walking stick and keeping my pocket knife open beside me, too terrified to even blink. Eventually, whatever it was began moving away, breaking thick branches as it went, and then let out a deep growl that still chills me when I think about it. In the morning, I examined everything around the fort and found the rocks, ranging from tiny to the size of a large man's fist, and I noticed the broken branches were all more than 7 feet off the ground and about 3 inches thick, many of them still green, which meant something incredibly strong had snapped them. When I returned to my dad's house, I asked if he had come out during the night to check on me, and he said no without hesitation. I trusted him completely, and to this day I do not know what was out there or what was circling my fort for hours that night. Story 29. I worked at a restaurant when I was 16 and was taking the trash out to the dumpster behind the building one night. The restaurant sat in front of another business that had closed permanently, so behind us was nothing but a large empty parking lot. I rolled the trash can out, and a random man suddenly walked up and launched into an extremely detailed explanation about his big rig breaking down on the other side of town and how he desperately needed a ride to get to it. What struck me immediately was how he was dressed. It was the middle of summer, well above 80 degrees, and he was wearing a heavy black overcoat and leather gloves. The gloves especially made something in my mind scream that something was wrong. He kept insisting I drive him somewhere, but I said no, and he just stood there staring at me. At that moment, a co-worker stepped out the back door for a smoke break, saw us, and asked if everything was okay. The strange man wandered off, and I warned everyone to be careful because there was a suspicious guy hanging around the back. Fast forward about 4 years. I was back home from college and stopped for gas in a small town one evening while my girlfriend waited in the car. As I walked from the pumps toward the store to pay, the exact same man approached me, wearing the same coat, the same gloves, the same unnerving expression. He started repeating the exact same story about a broken truck and needing a ride. 3/4 of the way through, I cut him off and told him I remembered him from the restaurant parking lot. He immediately looked nervous and insisted he had never been to that town and that I must be confusing him with someone else. I kept walking to get away and told him I was calling the police. When I came back out, he had vanished. My girlfriend saw the whole thing and was visibly shaken because she had heard me tell the story before and instantly recognized him too. She said he rushed behind the gas station right after we finished talking. I drove around back, but he had completely disappeared. To this day, I still get chills thinking about him and the overwhelming feeling that something was deeply wrong. I sincerely hope he never harmed anyone. Story 30. This happened when I was 6 years old and left me depressed for years afterward. It was summer and I was outside playing with our family dog. She was not the brightest, and neither was I at that age, and for some reason I decided to take off her shock collar. The moment I did, she bolted into the ravine and woods behind our house. Realizing my mistake, I chased after her. After about 10 minutes of running downhill and deeper into the trees, I reached a clearing. She was across from me on the other side, and when I stepped to the edge of the open area, all I could hear was an intense buzzing. All around me were about 20 raccoons, dead and impaled on wooden stakes. Mosquitoes and flies were everywhere, swarming me as I stood in the middle of a drawn circle in the still damp mud. My dog looked back at me and then ran off again. I was so petrified I could not scream or cry. I simply turned around and walked home. I had welts all over my arms from insect bites, but barely noticed them. I remember wearing a Chicago Bulls kids jersey with the number 23 on it. When I told my mom, she brushed it off as a story and told me not to play in the woods alone and that the dog would come back. I did not even try to convince her. I just felt like everything had been a strange dream. Months later, I returned to the spot. The circle and the raccoons were gone, but the stakes were still sticking out of the ground and trees, all angled toward where the circle had been. I could still see dried blood on some of the carved branches. I suspected the neighbor kids across the ravine, the same ones who used to destroy our forts and nail dolls to trees by their glass eyes, and I like to believe it was them. But at that age, I do not think they had the strength or willingness to kill 20 raccoons and impale them like that. I still have no explanation for what I saw. Story 31. This happened just earlier tonight. For context, I am from Oregon and currently staying at my grandmother's place in Arizona. I was on the phone with my mom back home while walking around the neighborhood at about 11 p.m. As I was talking to her, I noticed a man standing in the middle of the road about 20 feet from me. It would be unsettling for anyone, but something about him felt instantly wrong. He was not wearing a shirt, and his hair hung to his shoulders. And although the only streetlight was behind him, making him appear as a silhouette, I could tell he was facing me. I told my mom to hang on and lowered the phone. He turned toward me and asked, "How's it going?" But his voice chilled me to the core. Even from about 15 feet away, his voice sounded like a whisper directly in my ear, perfectly clear. Too close, too intimate. I muttered something about just hanging out, and he stared at me and said, again in that unsettling, whisper-like tone, "Not too bad out tonight, huh?" It was so strange that I actually looked around to see if someone else was speaking, but there was no one. I backed up slowly, said "yeah," and turned the corner. As soon as I was out of sight, I ran full speed until I reached my grandmother's gate. Only then did I realize my mom was still on the line, thinking I had been stopped by a police officer because I am 19 and had been walking around drinking a Mike's Hard. I told her what happened, and at first she thought I was exaggerating until I kept insisting how wrong the whole encounter felt. Later that night, I took my grandmother's dog out for a walk. It is summer in Arizona, so late at night is the only time it is cool enough, and when I passed the area where the man had been standing, the street was completely empty. No sign anyone had been there at all. Even writing this down now, I cannot shake how deeply unsettling that man felt in a way I still cannot explain. Story 32. This happened about 16 years ago to me and two friends in my hometown. And although the story is long and my writing is not perfect, I have never forgotten a moment of it. We had spent the entire day driving around, listening to music and smoking cigarettes, trying to enjoy the final day of summer before school started. Near dusk, we stopped at a cemetery where we often hung out because there was not much else to do. We parked the car and walked around talking when I noticed someone kneeling at a gravestone. It immediately struck me as odd because there were no other vehicles nearby, and most people who visited graves usually parked closer rather than walking across the entire property. The person was dressed entirely in black, every piece of clothing the same shade, and their posture looked strange, almost crumpled, and unnaturally tall even though they were bent down. One of my friends, who I will call Friend 1, did not seem bothered and assumed it was just a goth kid being dramatic. His eyesight was not great, which might explain why he was not unsettled yet. He even shouted something jokingly about the mall being open. But then the figure stood up. It was too tall, too dark, and something about it felt completely wrong. None of us spoke or moved. The world around us suddenly felt silent, though it might have been my mind blocking everything out except that figure. There was still enough light to see clearly, but for some reason I could not focus my eyes on it no matter how hard I tried, right until the moment I saw it open its mouth and scream. I did not hear anything in real sound, only in my mind. That was enough for all of us to bolt. We sprinted back to the car in total panic. Once inside, as scared as I was, I tried to convince myself we had misinterpreted everything. There had to be a normal explanation. I insisted on going back. Friend 1 agreed, wanting to prove it was nothing so we could laugh about it later. Friend 2 refused, saying we needed to leave immediately, but she eventually followed because she did not want to wait alone in the car. She always carried a digital camcorder for recording concerts and our usual antics, so we brought it along hoping to capture whatever this was. As we approached the spot again, my fear had eased slightly because I was sure we were about to expose the misunderstanding. But when we reached the exact place where we had been standing before, the figure was still there, still unnaturally tall, still too dark, and a little closer than before. Terrified, we filmed for about 30 seconds before backing away and running to the car again. We sped to a nearby gas station and reviewed the footage. We saw everything: the gravestones, the trees, the space we had been staring at, but not the figure. Just 30 seconds of normal scenery. That was the most unsettling part. All three of us had seen the same thing, but the camera had captured nothing. We immediately called another friend, and without talking among ourselves first, told him each of our individual accounts. They matched. As the years passed, the three of us drifted apart. I lost contact with Friend 2 entirely, but occasionally in my 20s, I ran into Friend 1 at bars or shows, and we would briefly talk about that night. It always comforted me to know I was not the only one who had seen something impossible. I still revisit that cemetery whenever I'm home. I have experienced strange things in my life, but I hope that remains the most unexplainable moment.